This is Hindol Sengupta. You're watching Global Order, and my guest today is Commodore Srikant Kesnur. Now, I invited Commodore Srikant Kesnur to have a conversation with me today on a few very critical issues. News has been a buzz, as it were, across on the sinking of one more big Indian ship, military ship, the INS Brahmaputra, which sank in while being in repairs off the coast of Mumbai. Now, since 2016, this is the third big Indian military naval vehicle that has sunk in this manner. Of course, there was the INS Sindhu Rakshak, and before that, the INS Betwa. A lot of conversations about what really happened, what could the military do about this. All of these questions I will put first to Commodore Srikant Kesnur. And then we will be talking a little bit about how India can counter Chinese designs in the Bay of Bengal, in its backyard, so to speak. And we will conclude this conversation talking about the big plans in the Great Nicobar Islands. Commodore Srikant Kesnur, thanks very much for your time. Welcome.
Thank you, Hindol. Pleasure to be on your show. Wonderful, and greetings to all your viewers.
Particular thanks to Commodore Srikant Kestur, who was traveling today, and on my request, literally landed in Mumbai and joined us. Thank you very much. I want to begin, Commodore Kestur, by asking you, what is your assessment on what happened to INS Brahmaputra, an important ship? Many people are flabbergasted that this happened. Give us your context of what really happened to this particular ship, and then we will go to the others.
Sure. I'll begin with Hindol by making a very slight correction to what you had said. I would not use the phrase sink at all because sink would indicate that the situation is not retrievable. That is why I think the Navy has very carefully chosen the phrase that it is keeled over to one side, it is lying on the jetty, and the Navy is determined to bring it back and make it operational again. Now, given that Betwa had a similar, sort of accident and has been brought back, revived, it is fully operational now. In fact, it recently celebrated 20 years of being in the Navy. It is back in action. So I believe that it would happen so with Brahmaputra too. We should not give up these ships as having gone. The Sindhu Rakshak was different because there was probably an internal explosion which precluded that happening. But I think we should remain very, very optimistic about the Brahmaputra getting back into action. Having said that, yes, to some extent, I share your concern that this ought not to have happened. There can probably be no justifications for this. However, we have to understand the situation. I mean, such sort of accidents, and accidents by definition are unintended happenings or events, are one part of hazards for military life. And here I'd like to slightly elaborate. A warship is possibly the work of a mad genius, because there is no other uh, place in the world or no other structure in the world which has hundreds or thousands of tons of high grade fuel, several hundreds of high explosive ammunition, lots of high power emitting radars, EW, and communication equipment, lots of inflammable material like paints, hundreds of miles of wires and pipes. And in all that, people have to live and work and fight. There is no other comparable structure to a warship in the world. And therefore, it indicates that every day, in every way, there is a certain hazard when you live and work on a warship. Now, these sometimes get accentuated in refit, as Brahmaputra was, because many of your machinery and all that is removed, which would come into play if a ship was fully operational. And you have to bring in human interfaces, and human interfaces sometimes there could be a problem here or there. So, from all accounts, coming back to Brahmaputra, what happened? She had a fire on the evening of Sunday, the 21st, and the fire was brought under control by certain aggressive firefighting. And by all indications, next morning the fire had been brought under control. It meant that now there was little likelihood of it spreading. And by around the afternoon, the situation seemed reasonably in control. At some point of time after that, in the afternoon, perhaps after 2 or 3 p.m., I don't have the exact time, the ship suddenly started to keel over, and it seemed to happen fairly suddenly after the fire had been brought down. Now there are certain speculations as to whether this happened because of a lot of water being pumped into fight the fire, and did it affect the ship's stability in any way. However, these are conjectures at this stage, because I understand that the ship was also dewatering aggressively. So it's not that they were not aware of these dangers, but sometimes, probably even after being aware, and despite best efforts, this happens. Perhaps there was some underwater buckling of some plates. I don't know. The BOI will establish that. But it sort of killed down to one side after the fire had been brought under control. So that is broadly what seemed to have transpired that day.
Talk to us a little bit about there is a lot of concern among certain quarters, Commodore, that this could have, or these kinds of incidents, should I say, could actually be created. We don't know whether that's true for the Brahmaputra, but could actually be created by a sort of enemy attack, especially using cyber warfare to trigger, a short circuit, to trigger fires in valuable, extremely valuable, naval assets like these ships. Now, talk to us a little bit about what you think about that concern and what we could perhaps do to mitigate it.
Yes, sure. I mean, when you talk about it, the probability or the theoretical probability of this always exists. And these days, we know that cyber in an interconnected world can influence, including triggering such accidents. So the theoretical possibility is always there. And until the Board of Inquiry establishes, I would neither like to suggest that that is what happened, nor completely negate that possibility. Having said that, my own gut feeling is that this might not have been so. I could be wrong, but my own gut feeling is it might not have been so in this case, because by and large, ships take precautions, and warships usually keep certain layers of insulation between themselves and the outside world, which means normally the warship's communication systems and other systems are not connected to the worldwide net. They are on certain intranets of the Navy, which is separated from, the global commons, so to say, the internet or WW, the World Wide Web. Therefore, the possibility of any such intrusion happening when there are sufficient firewalls and physical separations, to me is unlikely, because forget fire, a cyber attack can do many more things. It can steal data. It can cripple some of the operational equipment. So I think the Navy is very, very aware of that, and they keep their frontline platforms insulated from that. Having said that, these are constant sort of chess games with antagonists trying out various things. So I don't think we should close our eye to that possibility. But I believe the probability is very low from my understanding of the situation.
Move now from this particular ship to a broader question. Some of the concern, of course, comes, Commodore, because this is the third big such incident. Yes, it is true, like you pointed out, that the first big such incident after 2016 with the INS Betwa, was really revived and, was mitigated, and the ship is back in action. But since this is the third such incident after 2016, there have been a lot of concerns that there are loopholes somewhere which are not being plugged. I wanted to understand how you see this in context to your own career and your own observation as an Indian Navy veteran.
Yes, I just, having retired 2 years ago, I feel I'm still a recently retired veteran. I'd like to sort of address this from this perspective that, look, everyone's concern is understood, and I believe they make a fair point. Having said that, I think we need to balance some of the issues here. It's not about bean counting and the number of years between accidents. No accident should ever happen, and even one accident is one too many. You know, having said that, many navies undergo these cycles. Uh, Sometimes accidents happen, but they have less catastrophic consequences. Some they have more catastrophic consequences. What we have to understand of the Indian Navy of today is, uh, we have to understand that its operational tempo has doubled in the last decade or so. As the Navy is called upon for several missions, as India's profile goes up in global committee of nations. And remember, navy is a big currency of that. As we do maritime diplomacy, as we do missions abroad, as we address humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, there's an ongoing huge operation against piracy and other sorts of activities happening in the West Arabian Sea and the Red Sea region. So ships are constantly deployed. The operational tempo has doubled in the last 10 or 15 years. They are mostly at sea. Now, when you have such things, the chance of the occurrence of accidents also increases in proportion to that. Like I said, it must not happen, but greater the activity, greater the tempo, more the tasking, greater is the profile. Sometimes these things tend to happen. Second, I believe, though, that nobody understands this better than the Navy does. Let us remember that whether it is not having a combat platform for some time, or the loss of material or even people, it is the Navy that suffers this the most, both at a personal and professional level. So nobody in the Navy would ever want such a situation. And every accident is taken seriously to find out what can be done to plug the gap, so to say. And lessons pass up, drills are done, everything is done. But, sometimes, despite best efforts, things happen. They ought not to. Hopefully, lessons will be learned from this incident also. But sometimes it might seem a little flippant taking analogy of cricket or some other sport, but no sportsman wants to fail. No Olympian wants to fail. Your Navy is amongst the best that is there in the world, professional, highly proud of what they're doing. Sometimes these things happen, but I believe it is a Navy that will apply corrective measures. I think the determination to bring the ship back on operational is a very good thing. I'm sure they brought back, like they brought back Betwa, and as we are seeing, they're doing a lot of. Just 2 days ago, you had a merchant ship in distress, some 50 or 100 miles from Bombay coast, and it was a naval helicopter that went and in very terrible conditions rescued people there. So I don't think any questions ought to be asked about the professionalism of the naval people. And I believe, while the concerns of everyone are well meant, I believe the Navy would be best suited to take necessary corrective actions.
Before we move on from this, from the incident of these involving these three ships, I have one last question, Commodore, which is, what do you think the Navy is doing, and what could it do more to counter this fear or the counters, enemy attacks using cyber networks and so on and so forth, which inevitably are bound to rise, as we see, quantum technology, artificial intelligence, all kinds of things. These kinds of attacks are bound to rise. What do you think the Navy is doing, and what could it do more?
Look, over the last few years, the Navy and together the three services, one of the most transformational steps they did was to actually set up a defense cyber agency, uh, which brought in uh, uh, not just the cumulative talents of people and specialists in all three services, but also did a vulnerability assessment across every military establishment so that you're not hit from within. The first cyber agency chief was, in fact, a naval officer. perhaps, and the current one too, perhaps in recognition of the fact that Navy has certain lead in this regard. So I think at the organizational level, at least over the last decade or a little less, all the three services, Navy, have been cognizant of these challenges. So they have worked, as I said, while trying to take benefits of IT and networking, uh, try to be away from what can potentially be attacks from external sources. So Navy has built its own strong internal networks so that any of your communications or efficiency at work, whether operationally or administratively, is not affected. In addition to that, there's huge amount of, say, education, training going constantly in the background. There are constant cyber audits being checked, both surprise and planned. Uh, how good is your cyber hygiene is now a regular part of annual inspection. The IT officers at command and fleet levels are now, playing a very important, prestigious roles in that. So on the one hand, you are assisted in case you have certain problems or vulnerabilities. Vulnerability assessments are constantly done. Uh, does this imply or mean that it is 100%? No, as I said before, there's a constant race. But I think one of the, I mean, if I can again digress for 30 seconds, one of the strengths Navy has is that it has a larger institutional memory of being tech savvy, you know. So whatever your technical knowledge in other spheres ultimately results in a heavy or bigger pool of people who are better at this. And therefore, hopefully, they are more aware of cyber attacks and all the developments that are happening. In addition, I believe at the highest level, the defense cyber agencies are also networked with the national grid and with other national cyber agencies so that they're fully aware of what are the damage, likely possibilities happening. But we must remember, having said all this, we must remember that cyber warfare is in some ways a whole new dimension to warfare and to way of living, and where and how these would happen. I think in some ways, while the armed forces and navy will do their bit, it would also be a whole of government and a whole of nation approach, because your samurai warriors can be someone, as they say, sitting in a Bermuda short in some part of the world. So yes, armed forces have done the necessary mindset changes and all that. But I think this has to be a whole of government and whole of nation approach, even as the Navy tries to remain ahead of the curve.
Let's move away from the topic of these three ships now, Commodore, and move to another area which is of great concern. The in the Indian Navy has, for a long time considered the Bay of Bengal its backyard. In fact, this entire foreign policy thrust saying the Indian Ocean is India's ocean, essentially is on the back of the Indian Navy, because you can call it your ocean because you have assets to protect that region and really sort of expand your power in that region. Now, of course, there are challenges there, and that's a whole different conversation. But I want to come to Bay of Bengal. That really was always our backyard. But increasingly, especially in the last few years, Chinese interventions in Bangladesh, in Myanmar, has made this area, made the Bay of Bengal more contested than ever before. And questions are being asked: how long can India really see the Bay of Bengal as its neighborhood, where its power is unchallenged? Talk to me a little bit about what you think about that. What kind of challenges do we face, and how long will we be able to keep this as our neighborhood, so to speak, as far as power is concerned?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very interesting question. And like you brought out, China has been doing some both adroit diplomacy and lots of other things, including assistance in infrastructure and other areas for the countries in the region. And that's very tempting for those nations to take it and not say no, you know. And when you have, you see, so in effect, what China is doing is substituting. where it can't put its assets everywhere, because it also doesn't want to get into a overreach, fighting the US on one side, deploying its assets everywhere. It would want friendly nations here. In the Arabian Sea, in Pakistan, it has a kind of client state as it is. But it would also want certain friendships in the Bay of Bengal region. And like you said, it is working that actively with Bangladesh, with Myanmar. They are training, they're giving assets. Uh, when, for example, you give a submarine to a nation that's our neighbor, you're always worried, not simply because it signals a paradigm shift in your neighbor's capabilities, but you're worried whether that asset can be put to mischievous use by the Chinese or anyone to snoop, to be around. So these are certainly matters of concern. Now, you can't compete with China head to head, because ultimately it's about money. I don't have the figures on my fingertips, but as I understand it, even with the new budget, our defense budget is something like $75 billion, and China is at about $225 billion. So that's three times the size, and many of the figures are opaque, so they're probably spending much more. So having said that, I think the way to do it is a combination of three or four things. One is, I think, and we have to give credit to the government, to the External Affairs Ministry. I think our own friendships with these two countries that you mentioned in recent past has been good, and there's been a determined effort for us to extend our friendship across several verticals, so that they don't completely, quote unquote, fall into the Chinese lap. I mean, I think we have been expressing both our concerns and our friendship across several verticals, with Sri Lanka, with Bangladesh, with Myanmar. It's probably doing us good. As far as Myanmar is concerned, while not trying to counter, we also given them some assistance hardware. With Bangladesh, there's lots of other ways in which we cooperate. In fact, at the course that I went to speak yesterday, the maritime security course, there was one or two Bangladesh officers. So with Bangladesh in training and in other areas, the Indian Navy also does a lot of cooperation. And so I believe that we establish our own independent equations with these countries, so that they don't take unduly antagonistic steps. The other thing is, obviously, having said that, we got to up our surveillance quotient. And I think the Navy has been doing that very, very well. I would like to believe that the Malacca Strait and other places are under far more surveillance from our drones, from our maritime patrol aircraft and all, because the signal is out to anyone that, look, we are watching you and we know when you come here. I mean, the moment you let someone know that we're watching you, that acts as a deterrence in its own way, to say that, look, we got you, buddy, sort of thing. The third thing, and I believe this is the big calling card of the Indian Navy, is at the end of the day a very professional Navy. And not many people realize how this can be a deterrence in itself. Because when you perform very well in exercises, when your officers perform consistently well in courses abroad, when your ships sail out and do a whole lot of missions, the recent one in Arabian Sea, but I'm illustrating this of the Navy as a whole, where you launch people into the sea from aircraft, they paratrooped into water and rescued that merchant ship. And these are things that the whole world is noticing. A professional navy provides the greatest deterrent, because they know that you will fight very well and very hard. So, in addition, the Indian Navy is also doing what can be called as maritime diplomacy. It has pioneered or played an important part in having a lot of forums. There is the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, there is the Goa Maritime Conclave, all of these, which I believe collectively will add to some sense of strength. So I would like to believe, if I were to take a soccer analogy, I'd like to believe that we are still strong in our backyard, just as the Chinese are strong in their backyard. But you can't prevent an occasional foray into each other's half. And the only way you prevent a goal from happening is to keep a very strong guard and make sure that your halfbacks and fullbacks are very good.
Makes me, that's a perfect segue that brings me to the last part of our conversation, Commodore, which is essentially, like you're saying, defending strongly your own backyard. A lot of conversation about the Great Nicobar plans, even today, how much environment will be taken up, whether there are concerns there. But on the other side, many security analysts saying this is absolutely critical. China is building very significant, surreptitiously or otherwise, capacity in this region. Soon, the Malacca dilemma also will no longer remain as big a dilemma. At least some people are suggesting that. A lot of in between all of this chatter, clearly the Nicobar, the Great Nicobar plans of India building a far greater military presence and base there is increasing. Far more development, tourism, which will mean a lot more traffic, and a lot more development, including military presence. Talk to us a little bit about how you see these developments, Commodore. How necessary are they, considering all the things that you and I have discussed in this conversation? With the increasing fragility, in a sense, of Indian naval power in certain areas, and need to buffer up many things, as we have discussed. How important are these, and how do you balance this development with environmental concerns?
I would think these are hugely important. I began my career in the Navy in 1986, and one of my earliest appointments, 1988, was as a navigator of a small ship based in Port Blair. And one would often sail to Nicobar and all that, and you realize how, in one sense, they were very important, but how they were also remote and so removed from Indian mainland. They were actually much closer to Indonesia, they were closer to Malacca. You could see lots of traffic, but you always wondered, whether you were physically, emotionally, and otherwise far away from, mainland India, so to say. And you wondered what would happen if some adversary or antagonist came. And if you remember in 65 war, it almost happened. So I think the defense and security of these islands, particularly now when you look on them both as strategic resources and economic resources, is very, very important. I mean, look, nobody can say that a Kargil-like situation can't happen on one of these islands, right? And some people might come in, and yes, you may evict them ultimately, but the amount of effort it would take would be rather humongous. So I believe that the security and economic well-being of these islands is warranted. I would be optimistic about the Nicobar transshipment, hub. The Chinese Malacca dilemma is what they themselves have articulated. Sure, they'd like to get out of the dilemma. They would do their best to do out of it. And is this an Indian reply to that? Maybe yes, maybe it's much more. I mean, you're also ensuring that India becomes an important transshipment hub on a sort of global highway for India, which says that we occupy a very important position in Indian Ocean. Not to be a major player in this is somewhat kind of self-defeating. And I'm not suggesting that environmental concerns should not be taken on board. I believe they should be taken. I believe that the military planners, other strategic planners, and the environmentalists should sort of talk to each other, speak. Yes, there is huge amount of biodiversity in that place. Having said that, I don't want us to do the same mistake that we did in Northeast, where while Chinese built in a huge amount of infrastructure and therefore have now the capability, and India is in a tail chase. And then by the time you realize it, you're wondering if it should not be too little too late. Of course, we're doing catching up very well now. So we should not repeat the mistakes of Northeast in these islands. If we believe they're strategically important, we must find ways to conserve them. We must remember that environment can be conserved and ecological housekeeping can happen only if these islands remain with us in more ways than one. If they don't, then it becomes null and void. So I think very important. I remain cautiously optimistic of this step. I believe environmental concerns should be addressed, but I don't think this should be scrapped.
Very well said. We leave it at that, Commodore. Thanks very much, Srikant Kesnur, for your very valuable time. Once again, having dragged you as you landed in Mumbai after a conference. Thanks very much. Even though your flight got delayed, you were able to make time for us. I'm really grateful. Thanks very much for your time and astutely explaining many aspects of our naval concerns. Thanks very much for your time indeed.
Thank you so much. And since you're mentioning, the delay and all this traffic and both aviation happened because of the heavy downpour. And we must remember that the same conditions were obtaining on 21st and 22nd. I mean, yes, we can fight nature, but ships are out in the open. So it's also possible that elements of nature, high tide, all of that conspired together. Sometimes all of them come together despite best efforts of people. It's been really raining very hard and harsh in Bombay over the last few days.
Really well put in the perspective to what happened to INS Brahmaputra. Thanks very much once again, Commodore. Thanks for your time.
Pleasure being with you.